It is Monday, July 6th, 2026, and we left off on Hebrews 8. Hebrews 8. So we pick it up right there. Now, the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heaven. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better. Wait, what? But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better. Okay. The covenant he mediates is better, i.e. the new covenant, the new way of doing things. Not the old way, not the law that was shown to Moses, since it is enacted on better promises. For if that covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. There would have been no occasion to look to. What? There would have been no occasion to look for a second. There we go. My dyslexia is going crazy. There would have been no occasion to look for a second. For he finds fault with them when he says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they all shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest, for I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more." In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So this is interesting. I've asked this question before, but it really fascinates me, and I want to ask it again in a different way this time. So based on that last verse, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, meaning the old law, as in the Torah, what traditional Jews still follow. And so my question, what is my question? Does this mean that following the old Jewish law, i.e. the Torah, is redundant or is it sinful? Is there a difference? This particular verse gets to the heart of how early Christians and subsequent theologians wrestled with the transition from the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Law, and the Torah, to the New Covenant established by Jesus. According to mainstream Christian theology and the broader context of the New Testament, following the Torah is considered redundant or obsolete rather than inherently sinful. But there is a very sharp critical boundary where it can become sinful. Here is how theology distinguishes between the two and why the difference matters immensely. So first, why it is redundant or obsolete. The Greek word used for obsolete in Hebrews 8:13 is pepaloiken, which means to declare something old, worn out, or displaced by a newer version. In the book of Hebrews, the author argues that the Old Covenant wasn't inherently evil or wrong, rather it was a shadow or a blueprint of something better to come. Think of the Old Covenant ritual laws like animal sacrifices, dietary codes, and temple festivals like a photograph of a loved one. When the actual person stands in front of you looking at the photograph, to interact with them becomes redundant. Jesus claimed he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Once fulfilled, the external regulations, like the Levitical priesthood or sacrifice of bulls and goats, lost their operational necessity because Jesus became the ultimate permanent sacrifice. Therefore, continuing those specific practices as a requirement is spiritually redundant. Redundant, but can't be a replacement of. So it's not like you could keep following the old laws and not believe in Christ. Let's see if it says that. When does it become sinful? While following the Torah isn't automatically a sin, the New Testament explicitly warns that it becomes sinful if it is done with the wrong motive or theological understanding. Specifically, it becomes sinful if a person follows the law in order to earn salvation or righteousness before God. Okay, so it does. Yeah, that's exactly what it's saying. Rejecting Christ's sufficiency. If someone believes that keeping the Sabbath, eating kosher, or being circumcised is what saves them or makes them right with God, they are effectively saying that Jesus' death on the cross was not enough. The warning in Galatians. The Apostle Paul addresses this exact issue very aggressively in his letter to the Galatians. When Gentile Christians were told they needed to be circumcised and follow the Torah to be fully saved, Paul wrote, "You are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace." In this light, trying to use the Torah for justification, i.e. salvation, is a sin because it rejects God's gift of grace through faith alone. So the difference, lifestyle versus salvation. Oh, pardon me. The difference between the two concepts depends entirely on intent and identity. As a cultural or devotional lifestyle, it would be not sinful. So for Jewish Christians in the first century, and Messianic Jews today, in the modern age, continuing to follow aspects of the Torah, like celebrating Passover or keeping kosher, out of cultural identity or a desire to honor their heritage, was not seen as sinful. Even Paul himself followed Jewish vows later in his ministry. It is treated as a matter of personal conscience, provided the individual recognizes that these actions do not grant salvation. As a requirement for salvation, it becomes sinful. Imposing the Torah as a mandatory rule for salvation, especially on Gentile believers, is strictly condemned in early church history, such as the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. Okay, that's interesting. Now, I do have another random question. Well, not random, but we covered this yesterday. So apparently the Torah There's the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which for the Jews, that's their Bible. But then there's the Talmud, T-A-U-M-U-D, Talmud, that's used as, I guess you could call it it's how they interpret the Bible. So if they want to know what a particular verse means and they want breakdowns, they'll study the Talmud. So I'm just curious, how often have there been changes to the Talmud, and are there different versions of it? We won't spend too much time here. I'm just curious because we talked about this yesterday. The short answer is that yes, there are completely different versions of the Talmud, and while its core text has been fixed and preserved for centuries, it went through a fluid process of evolution, editing, and accidental changes before reaching the printed pages we see today. Okay, we don't need to read about it, actually. I just wanted to know if there were separate versions that are maintained, but this is not a Jewish stream, so we're not going to dig into it because it's pointless. Okay, so in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. All right, Hebrews 9, verse 1. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. For a tent was prepared, the first section, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of the presence. It is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a second section called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim, which were angels, a type of angel. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. Why does he say that? So let's find out. Copy. Depict a picture of the Ark of the Covenant and also explain why they couldn't speak about it in detail. All right, let's look at the picture first. So this is just the Ark of the Covenant, but it's not. Which we think it's in Ethiopia, but nobody knows exactly where it is. So we only have depictions of it. But this is how it's described. So the poles, they had to use the poles to carry it because you couldn't touch the actual ark because it was holy. So if you touched it, if a human touched it directly, the ark itself, you would die, which happened to Uzzah, which was, I don't know if it was David's son, King David's son, or I don't know. But I just heard a message about it in church yesterday. But there's a story about it in the Bible where they're trying to move it, and it was on a cart, and things got shaky, and he tried to stabilize it. Uzzah tried to stabilize it. He touched it, and he died. Anyway, these are the cherubim, the angels on top, and they form the mercy seat, and then the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod, and the chalice are inside the ark. Okay, so let's read this. That phrase at the end of Hebrews 9:5, of these things we cannot now speak in detail, is a fascinating moment where the author intentionally hits the brakes. Here's an illustration of what the Ark of the Covenant traditionally looked like based on the descriptions in Exodus, featuring the gold-covered chest, the carrying poles, and the two winged cherubim facing one another over the lid, the mercy seat. Okay, why couldn't they speak about it in detail? The author of Hebrews wasn't withholding information because it was a secret, but rather because going into the physical details would distract from their main argument. There are two primary reasons for this. Number one, it wasn't the main point of the sermon. The book of Hebrews is structured like a sermon, and the author's primary goal in this section is to show that Jesus is the ultimate high priest who entered a greater heavenly tabernacle. If the author stopped to explain the symbolic meaning of every single object, the jar of manna representing God's provision, Aaron's staff representing chosen priesthood, and the stone tablets representing the law, they would get bogged down in a massive tangent. They chose to pivot quickly from the furniture of the old system to the function of the new system. Okay, that makes sense. So it wasn't some great mystery. He was just staying on point. Okay. Or the author. I say he, like I know who it was. We don't know who it was exactly. So the author of Hebrews was just staying on point. Number two, the physical temple system was obsolete by the time they wrote Hebrews. It was a moot point because we had Jesus now. So it was obsolete. The central theme of Hebrews is that the old covenant was a temporary shadow, while Christ is the permanent reality. Spending too much time detailing the earthly tabernacle might inadvertently emphasize the physical building over the spiritual fulfillment. The author essentially says, yes, all those old physical items were holy and important, but we don't need to overanalyze them right now because something infinitely greater has arrived. In short, it was a stylistic and theological choice to keep the readers focused on Jesus rather than getting lost in the architectural blueprints of the past. Makes sense. Okay. Where are we? Verse 6. These preparations having thus been made, the priests go regularly into the first section, performing their ritual duties. But into the second, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. So he's describing the old customs. He's still describing the old customs here. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from the dead works to serve the living God. Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them, Jesus' death, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. So I suppose he's saying we used to go through all this hullabaloo, the priest and the sacrificial animals in different sections and the high priest could only go into the most holy place once a year, and he had to make a sacrifice for his sins and then sins for the people. But now all that, Jesus replaced all that, because Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. And so now we can all he mediates directly between us and God for everybody. Verse 15, therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. What does that mean? I guess I highlighted this for a reason on the first read, but I still don't know what that means. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Oh, a will, like a written will, like when you die and you leave a written will. Oh, okay, I see. Okay. So now, let me reread it. Okay. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Okay, so actually, never mind. That makes perfect sense. I thought he was saying God's will, and maybe he is to some extent. Maybe, we'll see. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you." And in the same way he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered, not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things. That's interesting. Which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. So, so this part right here, just out of curiosity, does this suggest that the ark and the other items that were inside the ark are actually represented in heaven somewhere or someplace? That verse from Hebrews is getting at a really fascinating concept, and yes, it absolutely suggests that the earthly ark and the tabernacle items were physical reflections of a grander spiritual reality in heaven. Here is how theologians and biblical scholars generally break down what Hebrews 9:24 is telling us. So first, the archetype and the copy. The word translated as copies or patterns in some versions implies a blueprint. When God instructed Moses to build the original tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, he told him to build it exactly according to the pattern shown to him on Mount Sinai. Hebrews is saying that the physical ark covered in gold, the jar of manna, and Aaron's rod weren't just random religious artifacts. They were tangible, earthly models of eternal truths that exist in the presence of God. So the question is, are the physical items actually up there? Which, of course, we can't know. But generally, Christian theology views this not as a literal physical wooden box sitting in heaven, but rather that the spiritual reality the ark represented is what resides there. The ark represented God's throne, his presence, and his covenant mercy. The tablets of the law represented his absolute holiness and justice. The manna and the budded rod represented his miraculous provision and choice of leadership. Instead of an earthly high priest sprinkling animal blood on a gold-covered lid, the mercy seat, Jesus entered heaven itself to present his own sacrifice before the very throne of God. A glimpse in Revelation, the book of Revelation. Interestingly, your thought is explicitly backed up later in the New Testament. In Revelation 11:19, the Apostle John is given a vision of heaven, and he writes, "Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple." And the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. So whether you look at it as a spiritual reality or a literal heavenly counterpart, the Bible portrays the earthly items as shadows pointing toward a real, permanent, and heavenly location where God dwells. Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. Okay, where was I? Verse 25. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood, not his own, but then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. I missed this part before. So this is interesting because I was just talking to my wife about this the other day. So this is where it says in the Bible that every man has to die once. It's been appointed that every man and woman, we are all to die a physical death. And then after that, we are judged, right? But the two witnesses that are mentioned in the book of Revelation, people think, I think it's Elijah and Moses, I think, but let's ask. But it's interesting because in the book of Revelation, the two witnesses, they come down and they convert a bunch of people, and they're unable to die for a time, and then they'll be killed. Eventually, God will allow them to be killed, and then they'll be resurrected again and then taken back to heaven. And a lot of people think these two witnesses will be, because they don't name them, will be, I think, Moses and Elijah, because they're the only two people in the Bible that don't die a physical death. And so since every man must die a physical death at least once, theologians think that point in time referenced in Revelation will be their time to die a physical death, and then they'll be resurrected. But let's ask about it. Okay. Based on the Bible, who are the two people that never died a physical death, and therefore are thought to be the two witnesses from the book of Revelation? Oh, Enoch and Elijah, not Moses and Elijah. Based on the Old Testament, the two people who never experienced a physical death are Enoch and Elijah. Because Hebrews 9:27 states that it is appointed for a man to die once. Many biblical scholars and theologians throughout history have paired these two figures together, theorizing that they are the two witnesses mentioned in Revelation 11 who return to earth, preach, and eventually suffer a physical death. Here is how the Bible describes their departures from earth. So first, Enoch. Enoch lived before the Great Flood. The book of Genesis explains that he had a unique, close relationship with God and simply ceased to be on earth without dying. Genesis 5:24 says, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Oh, that's it. And just he was not. And for God took him, likely for that purpose, to serve as a witness much later in his plans. The New Testament later clarifies this event in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews 11:5 reads, by faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Second person, Elijah. Elijah was one of Israel's most prominent prophets. His departure is one of the most dramatic accounts in Scripture, where he is taken directly into heaven while still alive. 2 Kings 2:11 reads, and as they still went on and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. The connection to Revelation. In Revelation 11:3-12, two prophetic figures appear in Jerusalem during the end times. They preach, perform miracles similar to those of Old Testament prophets, like shutting the sky so it doesn't rain, which Elijah did, and are eventually killed by the beast. The theological argument connecting Enoch and Elijah to these witnesses relies heavily on the verse you shared, saying it is appointed for man to die once. Since Enoch and Elijah are the only two human beings in Scripture bypassed by death, the theory suggests they must return to earth to die their appointed physical deaths. Isn't that interesting? Okay, an alternative view. Some scholars suggest the two witnesses are actually Moses and Elijah. I knew I'd heard that somewhere. Are actually Moses and Elijah. The reasoning here is that the miracles performed by the witnesses in Revelation mirror the plagues of Egypt, i.e. turning the water to blood, which is associated with Moses, and the withholding of rain and calling down fire associated with Elijah. Furthermore, Moses and Elijah were the two figures who appeared with Jesus at the Transfiguration when they went up on the mountain. However, because Moses did experience a physical death, Deuteronomy 34:5, the Enoch-Elijah pairing remains the most popular theory regarding the die once rule. Man, fascinating stuff. Okay, I just love that kind of stuff. All right, so that's was at the end of... Yeah, that was right at the end. Okay, so that's it for Hebrews 9. We're now into Hebrews 10. We'll pick this up tomorrow night. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to drop a sub, share it with a friend.